even though I live not very far from here, actually, in Missoula, Montana. I've never been to this part of the world, and I'm really looking forward to getting to know some new faces and put faces on names that I've seen on the papers and so forth. So, okay, well, one thing that we do have going for us is this thing called the Wilderness Act. In 1964, some really thoughtful and very dedicated people worked really hard in a bipartisan effort, actually, to get a system of lands designated where they would be managed for their natural processes, where humans would not interfere with those natural processes and we'd let things play out. We don't have roads in wilderness areas, we don't log them, and it's really just a treasure that we have. And since 1964, we've added lands to that system in subsequent legislation, and it now stands at 765 separate units and comprises 44 million hectares. It's managed by 4 different agencies, which are shown in those different colors. And I'm lucky enough to work for a federal research group that's all about wilderness science. We use wilderness as a natural laboratory for better understanding ecological dynamics and for better understanding, we use wilderness as like this natural benchmark that we can compare other lands to better understand how much we've altered this world that we live in. And we also can take what we learn inside of wilderness and apply it elsewhere to outside wilderness. We also conduct science that's for wilderness managers for the purpose of trying to help them make decisions on the land, help them understand whether and where and when they might need to intervene, even though they're supposed to have as much of a hands-off approach as possible. And so when we study fire at the Wilderness Institute, at the Research Institute, we're looking through this frame or this lens of wilderness. And when we do that, we view fire as it's not a problem. Fire from the wilderness perspective is just an ecological process. And if there's any problem associated with fire, it's actually fire suppression. Fire suppression is a problem because it interferes with natural processes and it is a human manipulation of the land in a big way. So I'm going to invite you today to look through that wilderness lens with me and try to glean some insights that I think we have about wilderness, resilience, and fire. So I'm going to be talking about ecological resilience, a little bit different than the resilience that was talked about with the emergency response and human communities earlier. The definition I'm working with here is the ability of an ecosystem to absorb disturbances, to absorb stressors without undergoing a fundamental change in its structure and functions. And when we lose that ability, when resilience is reduced, we run the risk of becoming vulnerable to disturbances that we were previously able to cope with. And if we undergo a change in our basic structure and function, we might not be as happy with this new domain or this new regime that takes its place. And in order to get it back, it may be impossible. Restoration can be really complicated or expensive or, like I said, basically virtually impossible. So one of the conceptual models that's frequently used is the idea of this stability landscape, where we have these peaks and valleys, on this smooth surface here. And the ecosystem is represented by that little blue dot. And imagine it as a little blue ball that's rolling around on this landscape. And it's continually drawn into the domain that it's in. It tends to want to stay within one of those valleys, but it's always moving around. And different stressors, different disturbances are pushing it around the landscape. If those stresses are big enough, they can actually push that ball, that ecosystem, into another stability domain. And that's what we're talking about with the risk of losing resilience, is that could happen. So we can take a cross-section of that stability landscape and represent it in 2D. And here's an example. I'll just run through what this looks like for a fire situation. So resilience to fire of a ponderous pine forest ecosystem. And we have this little ball that's representing the ecosystem, and it's rolling around in that valley. It's never the same, it's always dynamic, right? It's always changing as succession proceeds. But we have frequent low-intensity fire that's stabilizing it, keeping it within that stability domain, in that valley. Just for sake of time here, that if we exclude fire, what do we end up getting? We end up getting shade-tolerant trees growing up in an understory, forest density increasing, fuel loads building up, ladder fuels being created, and that ball is getting pushed up to that high bump on the outside of that valley into an unstable position. And when a fire does occur, because it'll occur, when a fire does occur, it could kill all the ponderosa pine, become a crown fire, and if we lose the overstory ponderosa pine, you could even end up in the next valley over, where maybe what we would end up with would be something like a shrubland that is then stable, perpetuated by a high severity fire regime, but it's very different. It looks different and it functions different than that ponderosa pine system. So here's the cartoon. So with fire exclusion, we no longer have those stabilizing feedbacks. And then when fire does occur, we have the potential for something like this to happen. And it's going to be hard to convert that shrubland back to a ponderosa pine forest. So usually when we're talking about building resilience, I think it's fair to say that we're interested in really trying to keep things in this familiar stability domain that we're in. So what does wilderness have to speak to about this idea of resilience? Well, back in the late 60s and early 70s, there was sort of an unplanned natural experiment in fire management that took place. A group of brave souls, managers of a couple of wilderness areas, realized that, well, hey, we're managing wilderness, we're not supposed to be interfering with things, we're supposed to let natural processes operate, why are we suppressing fires? So they opted to intentionally allow fires to burn for the purpose of their ecological benefits. And in this practice, I'm going to talk about it, I'm going to refer to it as wilderness fire, even though it doesn't take place only in wilderness these days, but it has its roots in wilderness and it has its richest history in wilderness. It's gone by a whole bunch of other names throughout the years and policy changes, etc. But this was a big deal because it was exactly opposite to how we were doing everything until the state of knowledge at the time. So these two areas, it required major policy changes in both the Forest Service and the Park Service. And these were the two places where the experiment started. And then a few other areas came on board and started practicing this approach to fire management. So most of these places, if you see, are in the western United States. And most of these places have a lot of low to mixed severity fire regimes. A lot of these places have, they're coniferous forests, they're dry coniferous forests. Most of the examples are. And so those are the examples that I'm going to be drawing from today. And so what I want to do is I want to tell you about 3 different insights from this sort of unplanned, uncontrolled natural experiment in fire management. So the first is that fire is a self-limiting process that contributes to the dynamic equilibrium that confers this resilience that I showed you with that conceptual model. And there are a series of research projects led by my colleague, Sean Parks, at the Leopold Institute that show this self-limiting feature in these forests. And the first research project demonstrated that fire is a self-limiting process in terms of fire occurrence. And what Sean did is he looked at ignition point locations and where they landed, and found that they landed on areas that had previously burned way less often than you would expect them to by chance. And so we concluded that previous burns limit the ignitability, limit the fire occurrence of subsequent fires, or the occurrence of subsequent fires. And that this effect didn't last forever, that there was a time frame associated with it, but depending on the ecosystem, could last up to somewhere around 25 years or more. And he did this for 4 study areas across the western United States. So pretty strong findings there. The second way that he found fire to be self-limiting was in terms of extent. And so he, for those same 4 study areas, he looked at how fire perimeters interacted with previous fire perimeters and found that indeed, yes, they do. Previous burns are responsible for limiting the spread of subsequent fires, and that effect also has a longevity to it, anywhere from 6 to 18 years, depending on which study area we're looking at. And then he also was able to quantify how that effect, that sort of barrier effect, decreased under extreme weather conditions. And that corroborated some other findings that had been done in the Sierra Nevada by Brandon Collins and others, and Casey Teskey in the Northern Rockies. And then the third way was in terms of burn severity. And so looking at burn severity data for a whole series of fires, we were able to compare portions of fires that were in reburns. So portions of fires that were reburning or overlapping previous burns, comparing the severity for those portions with portions of fires that weren't reburns, and found that reburns have lower severity than areas that were not reburned. They burned at some time in the past, but not recently, before the data record. And that this effect also decayed through time as vegetation regrew. And so that's illustrated here in this map, but I think I'll skip that. Okay, so the second insight that we can gain from this experiment, insights about resilience, is that some forests, even though fire may have been excluded for a long period of time, they can contain a latent resilience. And this figure is from a paper by Andrew Larson and others at the University of Montana. And he did some work in the Bob Marshall Wilderness in Montana. That's home to mixed severity forest of large logical pine, ponderosa pine, Douglas fir. But this forest historically had like an open savanna-like structure to it with very large ponderosa pine in the overstory and pretty open and park-like that was maintained by historic frequent fire. And then with fire exclusion, we saw the typical changes that we would expect with succession, denser forests, more fuels. And then in 2003, a fire burned through this area. And some researchers from the Forest Service, Bob Keene and Steve Arno, went out and assessed fire effects. And they found that after that severe fire came through, that a lot of the big old ponderosa pine that had survived fire forever, for many, many years and decades, were dead or dying. And then there was a carpet of logical pine seedlings that were doing really well, and it looked like, wow, we've lost this old growth structure of the ponderosa pine. We're on a trajectory toward a closed canopy logical pine forest that's just going to be maintained by high severity. It's like, wow, well, we may have lost something special here. And then, so that was in 2003 and the years after that. Then in 2011, another fire came through and burned through here. And that's the fire that Andrew studied. And he found that, that second fire cleaned out the logical pine, cleaned up a lot of the heavy down fuels, it opened things up, and those ponderosa pine that looked like they were dying, they actually weren't dying, and some of them survived and could be seed sources for the future. So we saw that we had this system that was on a trajectory toward being something different. There you go. But that it contained enough resilience in it to actually put it on a trajectory back into the historical stable domain. It took 2 fires, though. And then the third insight is that wilderness fires are more heterogeneous than the fires that we try to suppress. And the heterogeneity is important for resilience because heterogeneity allows for a wider diversity of habitats and species. It's kind of a great way to keep all the parts, like to paraphrase Aldo Leopold. If you're going to tinker with something, you want to save all the parts. And then, in addition, you can just think about, from the fire perspective, that it should be really important for landscape recovery and regeneration processes to have a mixture of, unburned or lightly burned areas close by to your high severity patches. You need that heterogeneity on the landscape. So wilderness fires are more heterogeneous. This is maybe in the hypothesis stage type of insight. And they're more heterogeneous because they burn for longer durations. We're letting them burn. We're not trying to put them out. So they were more likely to encounter heterogeneous burning conditions and in Yosemite National Park, Jan van Wagendonk and James Lutz found that they burn like twice as long as the fires that we're trying to suppress. And there's some indication that that these fires that we let burn on their own terms have less high severity in them than fires that we're trying to put out. And that may be because the fires that we're trying to put out really are only burning under those really extreme weather conditions, whereas these wilderness fires are actually experiencing some moderate weather conditions, and maybe that contributes to moderate severity. And then that we seem to think that wilderness fires are more heterogeneous is that we found that at least one study has found that the patch size of high severity is actually smaller in these wilderness type fires compared to those fires that are being suppressed. There you go. All right. So what have we learned? We've learned these insights that fire is a self-limiting process that helps keep us in this dynamic equilibrium and helps keep systems resilient. That forests, even after fire's been excluded for a really long period of time, can have enough resilience in them that they may not experience the shift, even if they are at that unstable point, but that it might take 2 entries or 3 entries in order for us to see that trajectory reverse. And that heterogeneity, that wilderness fires contribute a lot of heterogeneity that's really needed for resilience. So all of that adds up to, if we're going to be trying to build resilience and manage resilient landscapes, all of that adds up to an argument for expanding wilderness fire. Now the question is, can we really do that? So, wilderness fire, yeah, it's great. I don't care kind of evangelizing, but most fires in most wilderness areas are still suppressed. And if we don't have the ability or the political will to do it there, where are we going to be able to do it? And one of the reasons is because of the risks that fires can pose to values that are outside of the wilderness, like this home here that's, the wilderness boundary is just over the top of that first hill there. So, but that's not the only issue. There are lots of factors that influence that decision to let fires burn. It's a really hard decision for a manager to make for a whole variety of reasons that I'm not going to go into because I don't have time. But I'd love to chat over a glass of wine or something like that about some of these, because it's fascinating stuff. Policy's not a problem now, though, and we have better risk assessment tools available to us. And so I'm kind of hopeful. Here's, I'm going to leave you on a positive note with sort of a roadmap for how to, using an example out there. And this is this idea of a 3-zone approach on the landscape. And this idea's been out there for a while. I think maybe first proposed by Arno and Brown in 1989, and then Ablett and Wilmer from the Wilderness Society picked up on it. And then most recently, Matt Thompson and Phil Bowden and others have demonstrated it or illustrated it for this landscape in the central Sierra Nevada that's shown here. And the idea of this 3-zone approach is that there would be a protect zone. This is the zone where people live. And here, we're not going to be letting fire burn. We're going to be suppressing. And we're going to be using fuel treatments to make fire suppression more effective. But then we're going to have this restore zone where we do have some opportunity for letting fire burn. And we're going to use fuel treatments to create even more opportunities to let fire burn. And then finally we have this green zone, which are these places where there is nothing to lose by letting fire burn. And we're just going to, that's going to be the primary strategy, and suppression really has no place or no justification in that maintain zone. And so I'm hopeful that if there's insights, if you buy it, that fire self-limiting, that it produces a lot of heterogeneity and that it can have a latent resilience in it, that we might be able to turn some of those yellow zones into green zones if we actually just do it, if we actually implement this strategy. So that's my positive note, and that's a big deal because I'm usually a really simple person. So, all right. So that's all I have, and I think I'll have time for questions. And thank you for your attention and bearing with all.